This week on In Good Faith, we're doing something very different, but also something we've been very excited about for a while, which is to start our book club. I'm Steven Kapp Perry, host of In Good Faith. We've got senior producer Heather Bigley with us.
Hello.
Also producers Austin Ball.
Hey.
And Peter Ellison.
Howdy.
So Heather, this was your idea, but we all chimed in with, yes, why did we all think of this? Why a book club?
Well, I used to teach for over 20 years, both university and high school students. So for me, one of the funnest things in the world to do is to read a book together and to talk about it. And not just in praise, but also lots of like, what in the world? Did you see that part? So yeah, I think that's a good time. And we read so many books here, and I thought it was time for us to actually get to talk to each other about them.
And the idea is not that just you as a listener right now get to hear us talk about the books. We want to announce what books we're going to be reading and have you feel free to comment, even send in voice comments or written comments. And so this is something we can all read and think about together as a listenership. That's very exciting to me. So the first book, this is one I suggested. So if you hate it, it's my fault, but I really liked this book. And this is Eckart Tolle's, and we're not saying it perfectly like the German, but we're saying it how we say it here in the States. It's The Power of Now, which he wrote in 1997. And about the year 2000, Oprah found it. And of course, anything she touches, it's like manna from heaven, and everyone knows about it. That's how I know about it. And it sold millions and millions of copies and was sort of the beginning of this mindfulness movement that we all hear a lot about. So here's just a little about this whole concept, which I think sort of sums up what he goes into, which is, and I'm quoting here, he says, the only important time is the one we think about the least, the present. And the reason the present matters is because that's where everything happens. The past is a collection of past happenings. The future is stuff that hasn't even happened yet. So we spend our life with our minds either in anxiety, which is worry about the future, sometimes depression, which is, oh, why did I do that? Or why could this have happened to me in the past? And so it's finding something in the present moment that can relieve us of those other things. I just think that's pretty interesting.
I have to say, as someone who's been through therapy, I was like, oh, right, I learned that in therapy. I learned this in therapy. I learned this in therapy. So there's a lot of these ideas, like when we talk about mindfulness now, we are really talking about a Western trend. I think when we're referring to mindfulness. Mindfulness has always existed. It's always been somewhere, usually in those Eastern traditions, that has been really important. And so he's really encapsulating like a bunch of different ideas that he's gotten from a bunch of different traditions, which I think is why it was palatable to an audience in the 2000s. Like, I don't have to become a Buddhist monk to learn these things. I can spend some time with this book.
This book was written 25 years ago now. And I think I've found at least that, our thinking on a lot of these issues has evolved so much since then. But this book does touch on so many great ideas. And a lot of the ideas in it are from these kind of different traditions being synthesized together, but it's still really radical. There's a lot of changes to the way we need to view the world to kind of understand what he's getting at, which I think is super fascinating.
So he's very open to spiritual teachings from around the world. He's going to quote Jesus and parables and say, well, this is what this means. He's going to quote all the holy books. Well, and I have to say,
can we stop? The way he interpreted some of those parables, I was like, whoa, okay.
Kind of esoteric, man.
Yeah, I'm going to let you do that. But I've never thought of it that way before. Yeah.
Including one time when he's talking about a parable I'm going to refer to later, about the 10 virgins and the lamps.
Yes.
And he says, well, the misunderstanding with this began right when somebody wrote it down.
Right.
Okay.
And I'd like to point out that's coming from a pre-existing sort of theosophical movement where you've got the perennial tradition. Some people assume that all truth is truth as it's revealed. And so the Baha'i faith kind of presupposes this. But it gets a certain bent in the mindfulness movement, especially with Eckart Tolle. He's sort of the leader in this second wave, almost, I'd say, of American mindfulness. Whereas before, you sort of had the beatniks, Alan Watts, Ram Dass. They came out with books like these. I haven't been able to read them, so I can't make a comparison. But it's interesting to point that out as well as we go on.
So I want to dive in with what caught my attention. I picked up the book. I thought, I'm going to give this a few pages and see if that's how I start books. They get 2 pages to see if I'm
Wow, that's
the Gen Z attention span right
if
there.
it's
Wow.
good writing. And I was captured. In fact, he has this experience that I thought, well, could this please happen to me? I want to be one with the universe. So I'm just going to pull out a few lines from the introduction. Until my 30th year, he says, I lived in a state of almost continuous anxiety interspersed with periods of suicidal depression. Sounds really great so
Wow.
far. Okay. It feels now as if I am talking about some past lifetime or someone else's life. So he's just ruminating on how miserable his life is. It's evening, he's about to go to bed, and how could he be in the state he's in? And he hears himself say to himself, page 4 of my copy, I can't live with myself any longer. This was the thought that kept repeating itself in my mind. And then suddenly I became aware of how peculiar that was. Am I one or two? If I cannot live with myself, there must be 2 of me. An I and a self that I cannot live with. Maybe only one of them is real. And that's sort of the entry point, I think, for the whole book. And he has this stunning change of consciousness that's mind-bending to him. In fact, wakes up the next day hearing music and birds and sounds in whole other ways. He spends a couple years basically in bliss sitting on a park bench.
Those are his words.
His words. I'd be okay with that too, but if that happened to me. But he starts talking to other spiritual traditions and seeking into them, and then he starts to realize what they are looking for is what already happened to me. And then I'll end with this. Later, people would come up to me and say, I want what you have. Can you give it to me or show me how to? And I would say, you have it already. You just can't feel it because your mind is making too much noise. So that's what I want to ask about. For me, it was like, okay, is my mind making too much noise? Because I think I live in my thoughts continually.
Well, I think that's a fascinating. This is a fascinating idea to introduce to a bunch of people who are invested in college education, right? And also are writers, is to be like, oh, you shouldn't be thinking so much. And I'm very much identified with the voice in my head. So I was very resistant to like the first half of this book. Like,
Right.
I was just like, come on, man. Like,
Because my voice is the voice that I project into the world,
Yes.
this thinking part of me.
right. Yeah, very much.
When I was first reading this description of how we make so much noise in our heads, whether it's our own voice or voices of those around us, that we don't actually get to know the real self that might exist within, I was kind of shocked by this because so this is something I've been thinking about for a while, but this book kind of catalyzed it. I fill my head with so much noise, whether it's headphones with music going almost all day, every day, or like kind of ironically other podcasts or YouTube videos. I almost constantly have someone, whether it's myself or another human being, talking into my head.
Right.
And
Well, you're reminding me of an essay from, oh my gosh, 200, 300 years ago, and I can't remember the author, where he says, if you really want to know what to think, you have to stop reading. Like, you think
Yeah.
that by reading, you're going to learn how to think or what to think, but actually you're just filling your head with other voices. So
Yeah.
what is it that you think, right? So again, this idea has been around a lot, and also, but I think there's a space or there's a time when we do need that. I'm going to push back a little bit from against Tolle and say, we do need to have other voices for a while.
So I'm thinking of, as you've been talking, philosophy phrases are popping into my mind like, know thyself.
Right.
Also, the unexamined life is not worth living. And so one thing that was useful to me is this idea of and therapists have really latched onto this as a benefit for people, which is stilling your mind. Not that I thought meditation was, I will stop thinking, and so I could never do it. And I really gleaned from this something useful, which is, no, it is creating a bit of distance, and I'm observing the thoughts, but I'm not attaching to each one and then worried and writing out 3 ways I can prepare for this thing that may happen in the future. It's just, I observe it. It's like it's floating down the river like a leaf. I acknowledge it, good, bad, frightening, whatever. It's a thing. And then I let it float past.
So here's a question I have for all of you. How many of you sat down and did any of the exercises?
C'est moi.
I did one.
I did one.
Okay, what did you do,
I
Peter?
felt bad. There was this one exercise where he described like being still, like putting everything away and kind of feeling the body, and kind of like bringing your awareness to the body itself, and then kind of letting that wash over you, and then kind of trying to leave the body a little bit. I don't know if it worked for me. I've trained myself to be too loud in the head.
Well, I think I'm just old, so I'd be like, I'm looking at I'm like thinking about my body. I'm like, oh yeah, my shoulder, oh that hurts. Oh, my feet are cold. Oh, so it was just like became a litany of all the things that were wrong. Like, and there's one section where he kept saying, what's wrong now? Like, and that's supposed to solve a problem. And I think you're supposed to go nothing. But I was like, oh yeah, I got a list. This is how I'm feeling. So I don't know. Maybe I'm just too identified also with my old aging body.
Maybe a bigger question to nestle that question within, if we did any of the exercises, is if anybody regularly practices mindfulness or meditation.
Is that you, Austin?
I do.
Okay, good.
I haven't been doing it as much since the semester
started. You remained quiet when I asked that question.
Well, a lot of them, it's kind of like, oh yeah, I've done that a few times. I'm interested in his confidence in consciousness, because he says, if you can bring consciousness to your physical, he doesn't say this explicitly, but what I got is if you can bring it to your pain, whether it's physical or emotional,
right.
It'll dissolve. That's not what I've experienced.
What have you? Well, tell us about that.
Well, maybe I'm just trying to develop some solidarity between you and me, because
there's an alliance forming. We need to team up, Steve.
Okay, because I did this exercise too, so I have things to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it brings me into an awareness of the spots of me that are hurting, in my body or in my mind, in my spirit. I don't think that they should be dissolved in consciousness per se, as he would say, and maybe I'm misinterpreting him. But I think that there are messages in them, that we should take seriously.
Right.
Messages that we can act on, which I do usually. It's like, oh, well, I need to stretch or eat a little bit healthier, get a little bit more sleep, are usually the realizations that I come to. So it's fairly pragmatic. And those are the solutions for them, not more meditation.
Right.
It's sort of a springboard.
Yeah.
Really quick, I want to dial back into kind of what he thinks about being, because I think we've started discussing some really interesting perspectives on it. But, what does he actually say? And I don't have a great quote for this, so if someone has
I'm
one,
looking for
jump
the one
in.
that
But this one idea that I found that connects to this directly is he claims that the big kind of misconception that we've fallen into is identifying ourselves with our mind and our bodies. He calls the body the pain body a lot of the time in this book, because...
Well, I think he's making a differentiation between the pain body and the body, right? Like he's saying, there's a part where he says the pain body is the shadow of the mind, the ego mind. So it's this accumulation, right? This accretion of all your hurts that you've never dealt with.
And that it wants to stay alive by making you rethink those like a loop, and it feeds off your pain.
Right. And I mean, this is something that I actually was like, yeah, I can remember as a much younger person, something would go wrong, or I would perceive of something going wrong. And then later I would just relive. I don't know if you've had that. You're all nodding. They're all nodding.
There we are.
And so, and that is a really painful place to be, right? And so most of the time I've been able to pull myself out of that. Like, I don't do that very often anymore. Though it is surprising, sometimes out of nowhere will come a memory of some experience where I am just like assailed by like, oh, you should have been really embarrassed by that, Bigley. And all you did was like laugh and
Wow.
like, oh yeah, that's just how I roll. Anyway, so I have these moments where I do get assailed by these past memories.
Yeah.
But-
So there's these mental processes locked together with our mind in a way that's, he argues, is really damaging and is actually not who we truly are.
Right.
It's this thing that we've falsely identified with, as you've been using that language a lot, Heather, which is so great. And it's by kind of observing this phenomenon happen, this identification happen, that we can start to kind of access true consciousness. And he calls this kind of combination of mind and body and pain body processes, he calls it unconsciousness.
Which I had to look up because I felt like the language for a moment was like putting those in contradistinction to each other. But okay, sorry, go ahead.
There is a vocabulary for this stuff. I think that Eckart is a closeted Vedanta philosopher, where you could, make this distinction between Brahman, which is pure consciousness, the only reality, unchanging, and Jnanam, which is the realm of name and form and identity. He doesn't get super
But no
specific
Gangnam.
about this. Yeah.
Dang. Sorry.
He doesn't get specific about it, but I think that's where he's going with his presuppositions about identity and reality, which I have qualms about. I also think it's very appealing. And so we can talk about that philosophical system. I just don't want to get too systematic because he himself doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
But that can be confusing.
Well, one of the things that was confusing to me and then has ended up being actually useful in my life, I'm thinking of a really popular Eastern philosopher who has a zillion YouTube things, Sadhguru. And he has this, he said 18 minutes a day. I don't know how he got this number. 18 minutes a day, you should close your eyes and you should meditate and say, I am not this mind, neither am I this body. That there is an I that is separate from those. And so I'm thinking, but neither he or Eckart in this book talk about the body as bad, which has been part of a lot of, especially some Western philosophy. So the single most helpful thing in this has, learning about mindfulness has been using my body as a tool for mindfulness, which seems paradoxical. And what he said was this whole idea of closing your eyes, start by feeling the actual energy of life that is in your body. He said it's usually easiest in your hands. And if you take a minute, in fact, you could pause this podcast right now and do that, but we won't. And feeling, and then moving through your body, concentrating each place and feeling that. And that was actually really useful to me, and I found it surprisingly calming. So here's a recent example. A while ago, I thought of this kind of a fun project I want to do in the future. I mentioned it to a friend. Last week, this friend makes this big announcement. Here's this project I'm doing.
Oh.
And I'm not involved in it. And I thought, well, okay, more than one person can have a project in the world. But I had this momentary, really kind of what I would call the natural man reaction of, wait a minute, that was my friend. And did they steal my idea?
Right.
And then I thought, no, I'll be in my body for a minute. Because I have never in my whole life done this. I am always in my head and thinking, and never in the middle of something like this thinking, here I am in my body, and actually having some awareness of that. And I really did feel some of that dissolving.
Wow.
Like, well, okay, because I found some solid ground to stand on. And suddenly I'm like, they can still be my friend. They can still do their project, and I'll still do my project. And I'm just not I'm not worried about it.
Well, and I think, one of the things that was I thought rang true to me earlier on in the book was when he says, if you're having a thought and then your body is telling you something different, pay attention to what your body is telling you. Your body, and I'm paraphrasing, is going to be more honest with you about really what the truth of your reaction is. Because I think we can say to ourselves a number of things, and again, I mentioned therapy. I mean, one of the most important things I learned in therapy that he talks about here is, anger is a secondary emotion. Anytime you're feeling anger, then you should really be asking yourself, what am I actually feeling? Which is something, I guess, if I were to have a mantra, and I hate to reveal this about myself, but it is, why am I angry right now? Because especially as a young person, I was often very angry, but felt like I couldn't be angry, right?
It wasn't acceptable.
It's not acceptable, both as a woman, both as a Christian. There's a number of layers about why this person couldn't be angry with people, which is why I became very funny. But yeah, just pausing and saying, what's really going on? What am I really feeling? Why am I feeling that way? And just taking that time. He talks about it here, but I think it's a practice has always been super helpful for me. So
I'm very interested in his hierarchy of emotions.
Yeah.
Because negative emotions he attaches to these false selves that we've constructed, such as the pain body. But our actual bodies have feelings like pleasure and pain. I'm interested in what he thinks of bodies, because the otherworldly sort of mysticism that he's getting this from in India, it's quite ascetic and body denying. But what he thinks is the realist part of us, that Brahman, that we are that pure consciousness. He associates with it joy, serenity, and some other thing.
Love.
I believe peace is
Peace,
what
love,
we emphasize.
and joy.
Yeah.
I think those are the three that he brings. But he says those are the being, right?
Right.
If you're feeling that, you're not actually feeling an emotion. You're just connecting to the being.
Yeah, so he kind of posits those as manifestations or an evidence that we're connected with ultimate reality, and relegates these other negative emotions to secondary or derivative status. I'm wondering what you guys think of that.
He talked he wrote, there was a section kind of all about happiness and like, when is it real? When is it fake? When is it fleeting? And what I took away from it, and it's probably very different than what you took away, was his emphasis on peace kind of bothered me a little bit, because throughout a lot of the book, he talks about peace being kind of an answer to what we see as our problems, but also as an end goal. And I'll kind of explain that a bit more. He says a lot that when we access our being and our true consciousness, our problems will disappear. Very literally, he says that multiple times over, our problems will vanish and dissolve. And that's so counterintuitive to me off the bat. I look out in the world and I see so many problems that at least
Dissolve, disappear, or dissolve, cease to be a problem?
I believe he means they cease to be a problem for you.
Yeah, and the way I interpreted that was you are no longer going to have pain over the problem. That's how I started to think about it. Because I, of course, really disagreed, right?
Yes.
There's the whole section where he's like, I think this is one of your quotes, Austin, about accepting or changing. And I'm like, okay, let's go back 400 years to slavery. So what is or even today, slavery exists, or people in oppressive relationships, or, whatever it is, to say to someone, I don't know, so this doesn't actually look like it's going to solve the issue at hand.
Yes.
But so I started to think, okay, well, but I have met people who have come out of oppression or who are in oppressive situations who are at peace. And why are they at peace? They've done something that sort of gives them the ability to face a problem without saying it's my fault, or feeling shame, or feeling anxiety, or feeling depression, right? And I think maybe I'm giving him credit for that he's like pointing us in that direction. I don't know.
If I can build off that.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
To connect it back to emotion, something that I was just thinking about when you were saying is when we feel like a deep emotional response to something that's going on in the world, that can be, I think, under his view, that can be our ego trying to insert itself into the problem and make ourselves part of this narrative in a way that we might not really be. It's very possible that like we do belong in this narrative in a certain way, but I think what he might suggest is that our ego is confusing us and causing us to identify with this problem and then causing these negative emotional responses. And if we adopted, our being and our true consciousness, we would be able to see the problem more clearly and address it.
This is a book club edition of In Good Faith. We're going to take a break here, but we will be right back with more about Eckart Tolle's The Power of Now. This is In Good Faith, a book club edition. We're talking about the book, The Power of Now, 25 years old now, and one of the beginning or seminal books in the mindfulness movement, at least using those words in the West for something that has existed really in Christian contemplative tradition and in Hinduism and so many other traditions for centuries.
And also,
yes,
a comedic bedrock. Okay, there's just moments that I giggled. So there's this part, it's in The State of Presence, which if you have a copy like mine, it's like 82 or 83. And he's talking about how everything that exists as being has God essence, has some degree of consciousness. Everything is alive, the sun, the earth, plants, animals, humans, all are expressions of consciousness in varying degrees. Consciousness manifesting as form. And then he sort of sets up why is there tragedy, though, in the world? And he has this line where he goes, if a fish is born in your aquarium and you call it John, write out a birth certificate, tell him about his family history, and 2 minutes later he gets eaten by another fish, that's tragic. And I was like, no, sir, that's comedy.
Oh,
like,
gosh.
can you just see the Pixar movie? Where that happened, I don't know, made me laugh. But so just these light moments for Dr. Bigley, who was resisting most of the time reading this and then had to giggle.
So, and I felt a line for me was crossed here when he's talking about, this is the inner body. And then he goes, I think, someplace, well, let's not judge it. Let's experience it. He has topics like slowing down the aging process, strengthening the immune system. Now, there are ways in which I can see all of these things being true. But he has this. So if you inhabit the inner body, this is page 123, if you inhabit the inner body, the outer body will grow old at a much slower rate, even when it does, your timeless essence will shine through the outer form, and you will not give the appearance of an old person. Someone asks, is there any scientific evidence for this? He says, try it out, and you will be the evidence.
Yes, I have "ha" written right next to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm so glad we related. I just thought, oh, please. Okay.
Well, there's an earlier part in that section where he says, your physical body will feel lighter, clearer, more alive. As there is more consciousness in the body, its molecular structure actually becomes less dense.
Wow.
And I put question mark.
That's powerful.
Yeah. More consciousness means a lessening of the illusion of materiality.
That sounds like the quantum realm or something.
Yeah. I mean, I put a question mark because, I don't know. But, as a skeptic.
I do want to... I am not going to go to bat for these ideas, but I will take an at bat.
Yeah.
To use that metaphor. I'm very interested by the power of placebo.
Oh.
Where, our body, our mind believes something, and somehow, some way, against all odds, it's manifested.
Right.
And
maybe that should be the sequel.
Or, the
power of placebo.
I think other ways people say that is the power of positive thinking, right?
Yes,
If you put something positive out there, then it will return and,
It will manifest.
Right.
I don't think you're going to live forever, but I think it's very possible that if you embrace some of these ideas, maybe you'd feel better about aging. Because one of the things, to kind of connect this to another idea, one of the things that was challenging for me about reading this book was the framework he's working on about like the lifespan of our consciousness is totally different than I think we normally think about in most like faith contexts. In this book, he's very much committed to that our consciousness is immortal and exists outside of our kind of meat bag that we inhabit for a little bit. And that took me a while to grasp because he's making all these claims and I'm like, what is going on here? And then once I realized that I think he kind of sees the existence of our meat bag as kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like
I don't
irrelevant?
know. Meat bag just kind of turns my stomach. Can I just throw that out? I'm just identifying in my body how I'm feeling about what you're saying. Go ahead.
Okay. I just think that once I understood a little bit more about how he views like how human lifespan or human existence, like kind of how long that's supposed to be for him, I kind of understood a little bit more what he was talking about with some of these more off-the-wall claims.
Right. There's a different metaphysics underlying all of this stuff.
Exactly.
And we don't need to talk about metaphysics too much. But in most faiths, you've got to make a claim about what's ultimately real. And once you get there, what's apparently real can be bent in all sorts of ways. If consciousness is what's really real and we can access it in certain ways, then of course it's going to have sort of miraculous, sort of, maybe, I'm not sure what the word is, unexpected effects in this kind of material plane. So I could see how that works for sure.
One thing I do want to say really quickly, just kind of about the book and about this kind of notion of humor and kind of what is he claiming right now?
Yeah.
One of the things that he centers the book, it's one of the first things you read right after his intro, is that he uses words in a very general way to gesture at what he's talking about. And he tells you very specifically to not get too caught up on any like one issue or one claim or one usage of language. And there's a quote I want to read because...
Okay, before the quote?
Yes.
I listened to this book while I walk my dog. That's how I read it twice. And so I'm holding a physical copy now. But he even says that hearing, if you're reading this or if you're listening and you're hearing my voice, something beyond the words is coming to you, which I think is kind of interesting, just because of the idea. So sorry, I interrupted.
Don't get stuck on the level of words. A word is no more than a means to an end. It's an abstraction. Not unlike a signpost, it points beyond itself. Which I thought is really nice. You know, I'm a philosophy guy. There's some Platonic overtones here. There's some interesting things going on. But it makes it really hard to kind of think about critiquing or understanding this book when he tells you at the top, don't take anything I'm saying too seriously. I don't know. I didn't love it. It wasn't my favorite rhetorical move.
I actually appreciated it because, I appreciated him acknowledging, right, that words are just signposts. And of course, within English studies, that's a favorite sort of a way to interpret. But I thought what was interesting is when he started to say, okay, don't focus on these words, like word sin. If sin's a bad word for you, don't use sin. It's just like how people don't like the word God. You know, it has all this baggage. And I think that's a actually really helpful move. So what is the word that's going to work for you?
Yeah.
Right? There did come a moment when he said, don't focus on an image. And I was like, wait, if I can't have words and I can't have images, like what's left? Nothing, Heather. That's the point. So it just for me was like, okay, things keep getting taken away and I'm not I'm not a strong enough student in this way of being yet that I kind of need those crutches. So, yeah.
So, Peter, you said something just even as we were setting up, and I thought, oh boy, I hope this comes up again. It was the idea, I think Steven Covey said this, about trying to have some space between the stimulus and the response. Someone says something and you don't go, well, thus I punch you in the nose. instantly you if you can be aware. Well, you talk about it because I love this idea.
Mm-hmm. There's a quote on my pages are 80 to 81 right at the bottom, but it's probably very different for you. And it says, "The wider the time gap between perception and thought, the more depth there is to you as a human being, which is to say, the more conscious you are." And that struck me because it seemed so actionable. And a lot of this book, super abstract. This seemed really doable. And in the context, he was talking about, looking at the sky, looking at a flower. And what we do is what he claims that we do is that we label it mentally. We say, oh, that's a beautiful flower. But what he says is that, no, we should not label it like that. We should view it, experience it, and try to sit in the gap between seeing it and labeling it or thinking about it as long as we can. And it's in those moments where we can kind of find points of this being in our everyday, which I thought was, maybe you can do a meditation to access the being, but how do I, with my overactive mind, try to find these moments? That's what stuck out to me.
And he talks about this because that could be someone has hurt me. I'm just going to live with this for a long time and not respond, which might not be healthy. And he says in some cases, this is a section called Wherever You Are, Be There, Totally, which I really agree with, especially having had conversations with people that I knew were really somewhere else or working the remote or something like that.
I recently, 2 years ago, was in a church training, and the church leader there, Elder Bednar, if you know him, he was saying, we're all pulled in different directions, and he introduced this idea of mindfulness. He's like, when you're at home, be at home. When you're in your church calling, be in your church calling. When you're at work, be at work, right? And so it's this idea of we're all overburdened, and this is just to say, like, this is an idea that's important, I think, and a lot of people are picking up on it. And we need to think about mindfulness is not just about being on my carpet and breathing. Mindfulness is about in my activity, being fully present.
So I worked at home as a writer for over a decade.
That's impossible.
I also...
It's the hardest thing in the world, Steve. How did you do it?
We barely did, and then we stopped because we liked eating on a regular basis.
That's what I do when I'm supposed to be writing.
Oh, is he? Okay, yeah. Well, I have to tell my wife to hide the peanut butter jar because I always just need a big bite of peanut butter to prompt the next thing. But I also had young children who, as children do, live in the home where their parents live.
Yes.
And these two things were two things that required, to me, 100% of my attention. If I was with my children, I needed to be there with them. And I found myself with these 200% requiring activities conflicting.
Right.
And it's the first time in my life because I always thought I was a patient and not an angry person, but I found myself being unexplainably mad, inexplicably mad, not at my kids, because they're just kids who need their shoes tied or have something cool they want to say, and not at my work because I was enjoying my work. But why was I so frustrated? And finally, how do I learn to be where I am? And sometimes I had to separate those things to different places. And I would just drive to the library and work in a carrel there.
Can I offer my interpretation on this? Not a psychoanalytic one. Just based on what you guys have been saying, I think this mindfulness you're talking about is a presence with our situation, wherever we find ourselves. And the quote that Peter mentioned, it's a mindfulness with self, where, you see a flower and you're very conscious within your own experience of how it comes to you. Like, how do you encounter it? What do you feel? So wanting to connect those, because maybe they're the same concept. I felt like they were a little bit different at first, where there's this gap and then where we're completely invested in the present moment. But perhaps they're the same. And it's through that gap of stimulus and response that our consciousness can bleed through. It's like a little crack. And eventually we'll come to a realization we're not as bound up in this entanglement of causality as we might think.
This is In Good Faith. It's a book club edition, and we're talking about the power of now. We'll be back in just a moment. This is In Good Faith. Today is a book club episode. We're talking about New York Times bestseller, The Power of Now, written 25 years ago by Eckart Tolle, which is a really kind of a foundational stone in the mindfulness movement, and interesting to us because he reaches out to so many different traditions and quotes, leaders and thoughts from sacred scripture of lots of different traditions. As an interfaith show, this sort of piqued our interest.
Eckart draws from a lot of different sources of wisdom. He uses Jesus, he uses the Buddha. I'm sure there are other examples. Maybe you guys can help me out here.
He talks about Zen.
Right. What I didn't like about it was that he sort of claimed they were all saying the same thing. He put them into his own interpretive framework and sort of assumes that it's the only truth. What is useful about that is, well, what's useful about it? I don't know.
I think with any book like this, there's this process where you say, I am coming from a particular place and life experience. I belong to a particular denomination, and I'm active in that. I have my own set of scriptures or holy books I spend the most time in. So I'm coming from someplace when I approach this. So it's easy to be reading, and then the first thing you read that's different at all is to go, oh, heresy, or oh, doesn't know what he's talking about. But to suspend that is a useful thing, because if you do, you often then will find the point of commonality you're talking about. But like you said, Austin, sometimes you're going, excuse me, I don't think that's even what that parable means. But okay, I'm willing to hear someone talk about, I wonder why he thinks it means that.
It's very inclusive, but he doesn't situate himself amongst a doctrine among doctrines. His is sort of the truth, right?
Right. And it's a rhetorical move, too, because it's, I mean, basically saying we're all connected to this one and noble thing, so let me show you.
Let me show you how you already believe what I'm saying.
Right.
I really feel what you said. In a lot of his quotes, I was just thinking to myself, I didn't feel like he was actually engaging with Jesus or the Buddha. He was just using a snippet of words to serve what he had just said, which,
Cherry picking.
really kind of rankled me. But I do think it serves a really important function of saying there is a bridge for you, no matter where you come from, into what I'm saying right now. And I don't think we have to take that as saying, him like colonizing someone else's faith, saying this is what Jesus actually meant, this is what the Buddha actually meant. But if I think of it more of as a bridge, it's a little bit more tolerable to me.
It's a gracious way to take it.
Says the guy who doesn't take it that way. So what do you do in accepting what is? Because that seems an important part of the book, that accepting things as they are. Now, do you leave them the same? Or maybe I accept that I am in this horrible relationship and someone's about to hit me. Do you accept that? Or what can you do? And he talks about this surrender. He says, surrender is not weakness. There is great strength in it. Only a surrendered person has spiritual power. Through surrender, you are free internally of the situation. And then you can find that either it changes without any effort on your part, or you can see how it should change. And I did laugh when I read this part. Is there something you should be doing but aren't doing? Get up and do it now. Or, alternatively, completely accept your inactivity, laziness, or passivity at this moment, if that's your choice. Go into it, fully enjoy it. Be as lazy or as inactive as you can.
Yeah.
If you go into it fully and consciously, you will soon come out of it. Or maybe you won't. Either way, there is no inner conflict, no resistance, no negativity.
Yeah, I mean, right before that, he says, you have three options. Remove yourself, change it, or accept it totally. And I was, like, glad to see that. Like, okay, so we're not just,
We're not just surrendering.
We're not just surrendering, or surrender means more than passivity. It means, I accept that this is happening, and here's how I'm going to.
Because there's a kind of denial that keeps us from progress. We've had a guest in an upcoming show talk about going into AA for addiction, and one of the first steps is merely admitting that you need help and that there is even a problem. And as humans, we are so good at not believing what's actually there about us, in us.
It's an important part of being true to ourselves, of being authentic, of this accepting attitude. That quote that you mentioned, Steve, is tough, though. He talks about conflicting desires within us, and I don't think that we can surrender to any one of them as though it was the chief desire. I think that we really are.
Say more about that.
Well, I think that we're straddling a lot of different impulses that are often in conflict with each other. And the existentialists would say that causes anxiety. And to be accepting and to be authentic is to take that as a given and just say, I'm going to be anxious and feel guilty for indebting myself to choosing things that choosing things over other things that I wanted to do. He doesn't seem to make room for that. But
I think how he would probably respond, I've been reading a lot of philosophy of agency recently and like competing desires. I think how he would respond probably is if you're accessing being in the right way, there would only be one like desire. And that
desire would be like bigger, right?
Yes.
It would transcend whatever small thing.
I think what he would probably say is one or multiple of our desires that are in like conflict with us are from the ego or the pain body. I don't know if that's sufficient, because I do think this concern that you brought up is really powerful. But I think that's how he would respond.
Well, and I mean, I just think of Adam and Eve, right? Given here are conflicting laws. Please obey.
That can't coexist.
That can't coexist. And for me, what a helpful way to actually understand human existence. There are a bunch of conflicting things. Please figure it out.
Which is why surrender isn't the appropriate program.
Right.
I think.
Perhaps, yeah.
We've got to be active in a lot of this. But there is one.
But maybe they could have never chosen.
Right.
And just lived in worry about.
Which is still a choice.
Yeah, not choosing is a choice.
Dun, dun.
I mean, just look at my dating life. I mean, 100 years ago, not now.
Yeah.
I'm married, but yeah.
So we have just a few minutes left. I want to ask each of you why you think this book is so popular or why it is meaningful to so many people.
I'm going to start as the non-academic person in the room. I mean, I'm an academic, but not in this field. And I would say this is big enough container to hold a whole bunch of different ideas and a whole bunch of different moments where someone can say, oh, yeah, I could do that, right? I think that's why there are 5 million copies sold, right?
Yeah. Including the 4 that we have.
Yes.
For me, one of the things that struck me about this book was that just reading it, there were a lot of things that challenged me and I felt deep resistance to and still do, to be honest. But there were moments, like you just said, Heather, that stuck out to me as saying, I could do this. And not only could I do this, I think I would benefit from doing so. And it helped me notice some of my own personal habits that are definitely not healthy. And this book his project is actually super interesting because it's so expansive. There are so many terms that he tries to redefine: consciousness, being, time, God. All these things this book takes a radical stab at, and some hit, some miss, but I think there's a lot of points in it that would do me good. So I'm glad I read it.
And I think the hits and misses will be different for different people.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that this book, for me, it adds to my toolbox of things that I can use to cope with life. One of them, for example, pulling a quote from, what chapter is this called? Create no more pain in the present. He says, whatever the present moment contains, accept it as if you had chosen it. And I don't know what he's trying to say totally there, but for me, it represents an idea that I can take responsibility for the present and move forward with what is, and not lacerate or.
Well, it gives you autonomy.
Yeah.
It says you have autonomy, and I think one of the most painful things in human experience is to say, I have no control. And I'm not here because I want to be here.
Right.
But as soon as you say, okay, I chose this, then you can start choosing other choices.
Yeah. So I think it sort of amplifies my agency in a lot of ways, this mindfulness. Very useful psychologically. I wouldn't count on it for anything cosmic or metaphysical.
I picked a closing quote here. He sort of sums it up from Eckart himself. Realize deeply that the present moment is all you have. Make the now the primary focus of your life. And I see lots of wisdom in that and have personal experience to testify of that to me. So this has been really fun for me. I wish we had more time, but we'll have yet another book and yet another episode, book club episode. We're looking for 3 months from now. You'll be hearing about that in your feed. If you subscribe to the podcast, we'll have a little bonus episode coming up, going in depth to our next book. Drum roll, please. Our next book, Peter, which is?
It will be Gilead by Marilynne Robinson. This book is fabulous. It's won a bunch of awards. I don't know them off the top of my head, but I do know that this book is just a truly beautiful meditation. It's a novel, kind of on what it means to be a religious person and lead a religious life. And it's just gorgeous. There's so much for everyone. And I'm so excited that we will get the chance to dive into it together.
This is In Good Faith. Our episode was produced by Heather Bigley with help from Peter Ellison and Austin Ball, engineering and editing from Daniel Phillips. In Good Faith is committed to the idea that we all benefit from hearing people of widely varying backgrounds share their personal experience with faith and belief. In fact, we think people with such experience deserve some of our best listening. If you enjoy the show, I hope you leave a comment or review where you get your podcasts and help spread the word. Find us on Twitter and Instagram at In Good Faith Pod, and our Facebook page is at In Good Faith Podcast. In Good Faith is a production of BYU Radio. I'm Steven Kapp Perry. I hope you'll join me again soon, right here, In Good Faith.